So when I was first approached about this and Linda emailed, and I, right away was responding and I said yes, and we had a conversation. But then it was, as time went on, and it's getting closer, I was like, when did I say yes to this? And then I remembered, it's the beloved, how we begin. And I want to echo what Mary and Judy had said about just being sister. So as I come, I'm sister who shares her heart and her experience. And I feel that just being here is such a gift, one among, and feeling that spirit within us, knowing that very tangibly. What does that mean? There's a blessedness and a beauty among us. And I'm very grateful for those who came so far or who had other commitments, even carving out time to be here. For those who went to attending the Flame and are choosing again to do another gathering is a great commitment. And I'm so grateful for all who are present here. It's no small feat. I believe that as we look at this, we've been looking at 3 separate moments or reflections on the vows, but I guess I see them as one single movement, one whole, one act of love. And so as we move through this 30 minutes together, I have some images and artwork and poetry and story rooted in my own experience that kind of unfolds the deeper meaning of that. And for you to just allow yourself, as images come forth, what images are there for you that bubble up? What are the poems? What are the experiences, your own salvation history that will come forth? And we'll weave those threads together. So I have always been drawn to all forms of art, and one particularly the sculpture of Rodin. And I remember one time, it was in the spring, and I went, and it was this massive festival, and so it was on the Ben Franklin Parkway, and I decided to go into the Rodin Museum, and meandering through the crowd, I finally found this sculpture. It was called The Cathedral. That's its title. And I love it. I think I was just mesmerized there. There's no benches or anything, so I just kind of plopped down on the floor, sat up looking at it, and it's the 2 hands touching very gently, but leaving space, that sacred space between. And it was God reminding me in so many ways of our relationship.
Joannie?
Yes?
You could just move the mic away. The Zoom people are having trouble. You're too
Okay.
close.
All right, is this better?
Yeah, it has to be a little further away.
A little further away.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks.
I am losing my voice, so I'll do my best. So just kind of wave if you can't hear me. So I prayed with that, and this poem came. This sacred space, this union that is ours, resembles the hands of Rodin. Loosely fitted together, not clutched. Loved in truth and freedom. You continually offer grace and never force your love. But rather you simply wait for me, for us, to find our way back home to this place of rest and reassurance that is rooted in the real. Our invitation to be women of love, to authentically live this vow of chastity, begins in this union, this relationship. And it is ours to cultivate, to tend, to nourish the space between us, the divine lover, God beyond all names, the person of Jesus, Spirit of love. This is our lifeline. This is our umbilical cord. It is a radical reliance on God so that we can be the cathedral, those living sanctuaries in our world. I love that line, loved in truth and freedom, not clutched. How do I, in my relationships, leave room We know our own obsessions, compulsions, that we leave room, not clutched. And we know the feel, the touch, and the voice and the whispers that our God is breathing into our heart. And I love that. And Judy mentioned about that ecosystem. So it's in that sense of self, our family, community, moving outward into the world. To know and be known in the sacred space allows us to move from a center, sacred core, to the circumference. From center to circumference, from essence to edges of suffering. From core to circumference, from essence to edges. Rooted in the real. So I share a story. I know I'm not alone in this, and many of you who've struggled with this yourself, or accompanied friends, colleagues, community members, parents who have struggled with a terminal illness. My mom lived far beyond what the doctor said that she would. She suffered with MS for 39 years. They thought she wouldn't live past 70, and she lived to 87. In her last 5 years, she had dementia. So I saw her walking freely, then with a cane, with a walker, a wheelchair, and finally, as we affectionately called it, her motorized wheelchair, her Jazzy. We even had a little nameplate for it. But I watched her decline in her physicality, but it was her soul that grew large ever before my eyes. No longer able to call me by name, conversation was limited during that last few years, weeks and days. So one fall day, running from program to program, I went to the second floor, B wing, room 210, as I usually did. And we had our own rituals by this time. So I would wash her legs, put lotion on her, parts of her feet that were most in pain. And I bent down as I usually did in front of her, in silence or her favorite music, Charlotte Church, blaring in the background. As I was putting the lotion on, bent down, she reached out her hands, 2 hands, like the Rodin. But she placed them on my cheeks. And she bent lower and said, "We know each other, don't we?" With a nod and a yes. I said, "Yes, Mom, we do. You know my heart of hearts, and I know yours. And we have carried each other for a long, long time." My mom and I were not mom and daughter, but we were kindred spirits and close friends. And as I left that day, I knew she knew. In the recesses of her heart and soul that went beyond words, that she knew there was love. And as I was driving back, I knew through her eyes and through her heart that remained with me that I was known in love. Heart meets heart in pure vulnerability. I knew God in that moment, that God moment. And God was saying, "We know each other, Joanie, don't we?" Later, she also said, "What would I do without you?" She had only a few lucid moments. And I said, "Mom, what would I do with you? What would I have done without you my whole life?" God kept saying, "Joanie, we know each other, don't we? And what would I do without you?" And I said, "And what would I have done and do without you my whole life?" Our vow of chastity calls us to nourish, to tend and sustain this relationship, this heart-to-heart, this pure vulnerability. It's a journey that calls us ever anew to offer an undivided heart made freely out of love for God who first loved us, to renew over and over again our initial vibrant yes, God sighs to be more deeply and intimately known in us. And God calls us home again and again. And I know failure. I have fallen, get caught. I have lost my way. I have felt exiled. But I have always been loved back in truth and freedom. That's what allows me to stand here right now. This vow calls us to daringly trust, to be in touch with our own loneliness, to know the longing, and to allow God to fill that space. We know each other, don't we? Uniquely and deeply, we know this deep personal experience of being loved by God. And as mentioned on that first night, and that desire to return that love. But we need to create space for God, for an evolving self and neighbor, to embody a trinitary way of being in this world. And as we all know, to be a sister of St. Joseph is to be about relationships. It calls us to a deepened knowing of this and to form a receptivity to it. It's not always easy, and it calls for a costly love. It's a love relationship that's profoundly personal and yet intrinsically communal. And there are moments in our lives when we know this longing, this emptiness. And I feel what captures it is this poem, The Longing. Lord, to this moment of longing, I am lulled as I listen, and deep calls upon deep. My body and spirit surrender, and I am drawn into the divine rhythm of all that is. I wait and listen for God's pulse lingering there, allowing my pulse to wed with God's. It is here that I am held in my longing. John O'Donohue has a poem and a piece called For Longing. And he says, "Blessed be the longing that brought you here and quickens your soul with wonder. May you have the courage to listen to the voice that disturbs you when you have settled for something safe. May you come to accept your longing as divine urgency. May you know the urgency with which God longs for you. Settled for something safe, a twinge in me. When have I settled for something safe?" And God has started, has begun, and continues to do something in me and something in us. And there's an urgency about it to move us out of that comfort and being safe. This vow of chastity, we know it's a vow of vulnerability, a vow of availability. The 11th century mystic, one of my favorites, Matilda of Magdeburg, says it this way: "New levels of intimacy between God and the soul continually open, ever changing us on the journey, and it is ours to empty out in order to enter a new threshold." To move out, to empty self in order for a new threshold to take place. Mary yesterday also said, "I needed to make room in myself so interior freedom could take place." This love, this vow of chastity, doesn't suggest but requires a cleared space. So creating a cleared space. I'm a little bit behind probably on my slides. Loved in truth and freedom. This was a sculpture that was in Lyon when we were there last year. And the sculpture is Renzo, was a local artist. I was just so taken with it, just the expression of being so free, a cleared space. And we know each other, don't we? Just that sense of oneness, to know and be known, essential to God, and how we are with one another. Lord, by this longing, and then creating space. This is another sculpture that, in that same trip last year that I was so privileged to be a part of, was this, and you'll see it coming next, is one world, but it was made with individual bronze pieces of individual persons connected to one another, but it was hollow in the center. And so we need this cleared space. So I share a story about cleared space. A contingent of mentors and students participated. We all were involved in this service immersion experience. We were going to Appalachia. Once we were there, everyone was given a designated spot, and I was to go with 3 other students to Bill's house. We found out that Bill's wife was in the hospital, and she wasn't allowed to come home until everything was cleared. We didn't really know what that meant until we arrived at Bill's house. So we knocked on the door, and Bill opened the door about 6 inches. And he said, "Thank goodness you're here. I'm so ashamed. I don't know how it got this way." And then with a shove, he opened it about 12 more inches. And from floor to ceiling was stuff. All kinds of stuff. And you couldn't see beyond where the kitchen or his bed in this small house was. So I said, "We'll be back. It'll be okay. We're gonna go get our supplies, and we'll be back to help." And as we walked back to the car and the truck, one of the students says, "What are we going to do? I have never in all my life seen, only on that hoarder show." I was like, I didn't know what we were going to do either. So I was just, and I said, "We're going to take one piece at a time, one bag at a time, until we can clear it out." Meanwhile, I'm like putting on my gloves going, I don't know if they're rats or what's under them. It was a little daunting. But 50 trash bags later, the big, black, humongous trash bags, we cleared the floor to a room, to a space, a small space. And Bill, with his hands like this, stretched out on the floor, and with tears in his eyes said, "There hasn't been this much space in this home in years. We've been living with the clutter. I don't even know how to thank you. My wife can come home now. I can breathe. We've been living with this clutter for years. My wife can come home." As I drove back in the truck with music blaring and kids chattering and everyone sharing their experiences, my mind and heart kept wondering. God is saying, "Joanie, breathe. Clear the clutter. I want to be at home with you." What chokes out life and breath? What cuts off this generative, loving energy that promotes a wider, deeper, loving relationship in the world? Sometimes it could be another relationship, compulsions, obsessions, work, ministry, worry, ego, fear. And I know all too well all of them, and it's more than 30 minutes to unpack all of that. But how do I create a space to love and carry sorrows and the world as well as the joys in this space? This vow to be women in love, we are called to catch this rhythm, to move back and forth, to find the ebb and flow from the center to the circumference, to the essence, to the edges. Francis would say, go to the periphery. Our founders would say, circle the city, go to the margins, be with the dear neighbors. Open your heart wide in availability to the miseries of the day. Our miseries of our day. Immigrant children taken from their parents. Violent treatment of refugees. Those suffering with the opioid crisis. the violence and domination of racism, sexism, mistreatment of earth, and the litany goes on. So how? How do we clear a space to find a still point, to hold in deep love? Not so easy. We all know, we certainly know, not so easy. Another story. I'm one of 7 and have 18 nieces and nephews, godmother to many. And I was babysitting one afternoon with the twins, Ella and Ava. And so I took them to the playground, and they were running from the monkey bars to the slide, and they finally landed on the seesaw. And they were there for what seemed for hours, moving back and forth, up and down. And then another little girl came and wanted to play. I wasn't so sure what was going to happen. Gladly, Ella gave her seat, but then she proceeded to stand in the middle, holding her body in the middle, saying, I am going to make it stand straight. And she put one leg down and the other leg down. I have a little visual for this as well. Holding the paradoxes and unioning love. So she kept trying, and they would force it up and down. She kept falling, and she got right back up. She fell, and she climbed right back up to the center. This went on for a bit, and then she called me over. Aunt Joannie, come over here. Your turn. Your turn to be in the center. Can you do it? I think Ella was just getting tired. And it wasn't easy to find the still point, moving my legs, which I did as best I could. The forces of the downward and upward on either side. And yes, I did fall off a couple times. But this echo in my heart when I prayed with it, your turn to be in the center. Holding both sides, as women in love, this vow of chastity, of availability and vulnerability, calls us to hold the paradoxes with love before we move out to the circumference, to the edges and the margins. The complexity and the polarization in our world today hungers for the ones who can hold all. I'm sure you and I know I have witnessed, and I desire to be one of those persons. I have a long way to go, but it's always the beginning with a desire. I have witnessed those whose whole hearts hold paradoxes. They can love those who disagree with them. They want goodness for those who harm them. They are the ones who hold two contradictory truths together, and they're not threatened by inconsistencies. Our vow of chastity as Sisters of St. Joseph calls us to this unifying love, and we can't do it alone. We need each other. The gift of this vow calls us to embrace ever more deeply the importance to choose life, to choose to stand in the center in complexity, in gratitude to hold community in all its fullness and all its challenges, to have friends who keep us honest, and to keep above all central this lover, this God, who seizes us and loves us immensely. We're called to make space to carve out for interior work and discernment. The Chinese poet Do Yun-cho says, "Stillness is what creates love. Movement is what creates life. To be still and moving is everything." And I would say Ignatian spirituality might say it this way. Take a long, loving look at the real before you, within you, around you, and then be in quiet. Before you move out as a woman in love, contemplative in action. To live this vow, to be a woman in love, is to have this before us, but to reclaim it and renew it over and over again. It's part of the inward, outward, forward movement, and we need one another to do it. I remember hearing about Mother St. John Fontbonne, and she said, "We are called to hold deep sadness and deep joy, all at the same time, my sisters, to be bridge builders in a divisive world. With one another, we're strong enough to set aside judgment, ego, so we can embody a generosity of spirit. It calls us to be deep listeners, to discover common ground." And so, one last story, one last poem before I end. I had the privilege to go to Le Puy last year, and I have to tell you, it was on my bucket list forever. I waited until after my mom passed away, but I know that I carried her with me and my grandmother. And for those of you who have been there, you know how powerful walking in the Founder's footsteps is. And for those of you who haven't had the opportunity, I hope you get there. When we entered the kitchen in Le Puy, Sister Simone was there, and she spoke to us all about the history and those founding women. And then Kitty Hanley said to us, "Now I want you to sit in silence for 35 minutes together." And so we all took a corner of this little kitchen. And in that moment, I knew that my God was surrounding me with grace. And those women were circling me. And as tears flowed, I knew in my heart they were saying, "We know each other, don't we?" Make space in your heart for us and for the ones who find themselves on the edges, even if it's you. We are your cohort. You do not walk alone. We will be there to stand, to walk, to hold your heart. We stand at a new evolutionary moment. The call and the invitation is always before us. The choice is ours to choose and to respond. Will we live out of this gift, this beautiful gift of this vow, as religious women in love? And so I end with a poem that I wrote in prayer after my time in Le Puy. Ready to respond. Embraced by the circle of divine love, I am enfolded by the women of Le Puy. Women of rock and fire, infusing passion and purpose and their porous hearts into my own. Grounded in grace, the embers and flame once again. Their yes breathes life into my yes, our yes. From the center, the circle widens. And we move to the margins. Trusting the testimony of this holy ground. The clarion call awaits. May we be ready to respond. Amen.